Hello everyone, how's it going? Nice to be with you again. I'm joined once again with Luke Taylor.
Yeah, that's right.
And first of all, before we get started in this episode, we'd like to talk about our Paul and Timothy discipleship programs, which will be running at your interest, expression of your interest. So basically get in touch with us on the website, over Instagram, TikTok now apparently, which I'm a little bit annoyed about, but never mind.
You suggested TikTok. That was your idea.
Yeah.
Don't say it wasn't.
It was, but I regret it. I repent. And
I also was a little bit reserved and conservative about going on it, as apart from being involved with Wildfire, I despise TikTok. But ever since I got on, I've enjoyed, doing the videos because of Hans Zimmer. But that's we won't go down that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Keep going.
But yeah, so Paul and Timothy discipleship programs, you can express your interest, and it's basically someone from our organisation will go with you through this discipleship program with the 5 stages of
recognize, equip, go, grow, and glorify.
And this way, we'll just walk with you and try and cement you in your faith, and you'll become a stronger Christian, and we'll just be walking through the Bible together. But if it's something you'd be interested in, then just get in touch.
Check out the website. Check out all the social medias, and that'll give you further details. And again, there'll be email and links for you to contact us for any further details, such like that.
Cool.
Apart from that, we do have to say, we talked about this whenever I was saying to Peter that I have a mentee for you. So a mentor, the opposite of a mentor is a mentee. That is the person to which the mentor mentors, right? It's quite clear. You have a mentee. What would you think from that? Okay, I have a person who I'm going to mentor. What did you think whenever I said that, Peter? What was going through your head when you got that message?
I had a complete brain fart and had no idea what it was. This word that meant nothing to me, and I thought it was a type of sweet or something.
Oh, that was so funny. She thought I was just offering you some chocolate or something, or new form of sweet.
Yeah, I had no idea, to be honest. You're kind of a weird guy, look, so honestly I had no idea.
But we know now, mentor mentees, that is happening. So with that being said, what are we talking about today in this podcast, Peter?
So today we're going to be talking about the book of Habakkuk, which is a book I hadn't really heard much of. I've never heard it spoken about or preached on, besides just the wee Bible Project intro, and I've read through it prior to prepping for this once myself. So it's not really a book you hear from very often. Yeah. But do you want to give us some of the context of it?
Yeah, so I was with you prior to this, and I suppose that's sort of a general theme of the minor prophets. Minor, not in significance, of course, because all scripture is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training, 2 Timothy 3, but more so in scale and the amount of content, you know what I mean? You've got Isaiah, which is like 65 chapters, whereas Habakkuk's 3. So that's what we mean by the minor prophets, if we do say that in throughout the podcast. But not much is known about Habakkuk. His name either means embracer or wrestler, which corresponds with the central theme of the book, this dialogue between God and Habakkuk through prayer over the question of suffering. It can be best summarized by Epicurus. You ever heard of him? A Greek philosopher who said, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent, that is all powerful. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent, that is, he just is inactive. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Okay, so that's a whole big chunk of a statement right there, but within that we can probably relate to our own lives of what is being said. And basically throughout the whole book, this question is something that we all ask each other, and it's a question that we all face in our lives, and it's certainly a question that is being asked in Habakkuk. This whole question of suffering and God's judgment, and where is God whenever we think that he is not there or not present in those moments of intangibility. So what I would like to say from the offset, though, is there is a dichotomy that is created that is to Habakkuk's name is embrace or wrestle. But rather, from the offset, we want to eliminate this and present another perspective. That is not to say that embrace is one camp and wrestle is another, and you just have to choose one whenever you're interacting with suffering and problems and trials and questions of God's justice in some of the most difficult aspects of society. Rather, we want to say that they're actually synonymous, that they're one thing, because by wrestling we embrace, and by embracing we wrestle. That is to say, if you have a problem, a struggle, a period of suffering in your life, and you're questioning why God is allowing this to happen, we're not saying that you simply just, well, you have to embrace it because we don't know and God's ways are higher than ours. Or if you don't like that, then you have to wrestle and you have to be angry with God, you have to fight with God, and ultimately there will never be a win or a loss. You'll just keep fighting. Rather, we want to say that by wrestling with these difficult issues, you do embrace it. That is, you accept the suffering that is in your life and you wrestle with God, because we are finite and we're in the flesh and we don't understand. And so we wrestle over these things and we ask God and we petition and we say, God, can you give me further understanding and clarity in these moments of suffering in our lives? And this is the prayer of Habakkuk.
Yeah, and the story of Israel in the Old Testament, Israel means he who wrestles with God, and Jacob, who then got his name afterwards, he physically did wrestle with God. Yeah. So it's something that even the characters in the Old Testament literally did, and the nation itself went through that wrestling process with God.
Mm-hmm. So the important conclusion, though, is Ecclesiastes 12:13. That is, whenever you embrace, whenever you wrestle, just as Jacob did with God, just as Israel did with God, and just as Habakkuk is doing here, and as we do in our lives, what's the important conclusion there, Peter?
So the conclusion, as in Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil." So whether you wrestle or whether you just accept, the conclusion should be fear of God, and fear is in reverence for God, because his ways are just, and he will bring every deed into judgment that you do.
Yeah, Genesis just I believe it's Genesis that won't the judge of the universe do what is right?
Yeah.
So that we can trust and have assurance in.
Yeah. But a wee bit further context in this. So scholars reckon this book was written prior to 606 BC, sometime within that century beforehand, at least when this prophecy was given. And 605 BC was the Battle of Carchemish, which is...
What the heck's that?
Yeah, so Carchemish, I think, is in North Palestine, kind of northern Israel.
Okay.
I could be near the coast. Could be wrong about that. I haven't looked at the map in a while. And basically it was a battle that took place between the Egyptians, who were ruled by Pharaoh Necho, and against the Babylonians, who were coming down, and they both met just at the central point. And I think it was Jehoiakim was king of Judah, and he was told not to go out and fight alongside Egypt against the Babylonians, but he did anyway.
Okay.
And he ended up getting shot in the back with an arrow. And long story short, the Babylonians won the battle, and then that's what kind of cemented them as the head honchos in that region for...
head honchos.
Head honchos.
I wrote the hegemonic power in Palestine,
yeah,
but I like yours. I prefer yours.
Yeah, it's just easier to say, to be honest. But yeah, Babylon became one of the superpowers became the superpower of the world after that.
Okay.
For a period of time. But it was this battle of Carchemish. But then these prophecies that we're going to read about in Habakkuk all happened before this battle. So before this battle, before Babylon comes, this is whenever Judah are still the ones.
So we're seeing some epic prophecies that happened prior to the events, and how you can't really explain that away. Within, again, a theological point, bring it back to Habakkuk. It's similar. Whenever I was reading this, it was similar to Job, I thought. And that is, there is this bewilderment or this dissatisfaction with God and his handling of situations or the events that are happening in that moment. And then the conclusion in Job 38, I'd highly recommend that you read it. God is just absolutely awesome and epic in his response to Job and their friends and what they had said. And in equal measure, it's we may not get all the answers from what Habakkuk says in the book, but again, scripture in its entirety, go to Job 38 and other passages to see what God gives further details to how he is a just judge and how he acts accordingly throughout all history and how he's still acting in history today.
Yeah.
Yep. So, Again, the question of why does God allow suffering, we've mentioned that a few times, but we do want to emphasize that we will be, again, talking about Habakkuk and just emphasizing those points, a breakdown of that book specifically, because we will do a podcast on suffering specifically another time. So with all that being said.
Yeah, and kind of the main point for suffering in the book of Habakkuk, or the suffering to come for Judah, is for the purpose of discipline. So the parent who disciplines the child is the father, or God, is disciplining his children Israel because of the sins they've committed, which again we'll look at later on in this book. But I think it's important to talk about that discipline isn't always the purpose of suffering. Suffering sometimes just happens because we live in a broken world. So, for example, with cancer, just because you get cancer doesn't mean God's disciplining you for something. It could just be, that may be the reason, but it's definitely not always the case. We just want to emphasize that at the start.
There's not a direct correlation there.
Yeah, correlation.
Discipline is one aspect.
Yeah, correlation does not always equal causation.
Yeah. So, with that being said, chapter 1, Habakkuk's complaint. If we read verse 2, it says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save?" Now again, we already talked about this idea of discipline, which is the focus of how God is teaching the Israelites in this moment, or in Judah. The northern and the southern tribe. In this case, it's specifically Judah, the southern tribe. But in verses we read that no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Proverbs 12:1, Proverbs 13:24, 1 Corinthians 9:27, and Revelation 3:19 all talk about this idea of discipline, of justice, and fruit being yielded from it. So within this specific context, over and over again, you read this metaphor, which is of Israelites, and how even when a tree is cut down, it will regrow again, and its new roots will not fail. You can always find in these verses of God instituting this judgment, this divine judgment and retribution, that the reason for doing so was to actually restore Israel into a position where they knew that they needed Jesus, or they knew that they needed God. 3 in 1. And again, how is that applicable for us in the New Testament? Galatians 6 talks about, if any of you is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore one another. So it's again, we are called to, just as God was restoring Israel, we are called to restore one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. But again, verse 2, we just read it. Habakkuk is offering up these complaints. And again, it's, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? The Messianic Psalms in chapter 2, 22, 110, Jesus on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, why have you forsaken me? Again, the questions are just reverberates throughout all history. The question, why God? Why suffering? Why discipline? Why God? And basically, I want to propose that by actually asking this question, why God? Do we not get the answer? Because our minds go to God. We turn to God in our weakness. Our inability brings us to God. That is, again, our only purpose and meaning is to know God and make Him known, or grow closer to Him. And so these moments of suffering, or these moments of injustice, where do we go to?
Yeah. Because you always hear the story of the atheists who, no matter how much they disbelieve in God, the moment they start suffering, that's when they begin to pray.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or that's even the moment where they start to question God's existence. So God is actually inserted into the conversation through the very existence of suffering, and discipline, and God's justice, and whether God is just or not, which is again Habakkuk's complaint here. And again, if we go to verse 4, read that there now. So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. That is to say, Habakkuk is saying justice is being perverted. Justice seems like it's paralyzed. God seems absent in this moment, as God is those immutable characteristics of justice and righteousness. And Habakkuk is saying none of those attributes are there. God is just not present. And again, to reiterate, Job 38 again goes into more extensive detail about the justice of God. But 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad." 1 Peter 4:17, Revelation 20:11-15, John 3:18. Again, all emphasize these points of how God is a God of justice and that he will judge accordingly. And again, those are all New Testament passages.
Yeah.
Again, just attacking that idea of Old Testament is a book of judgment and New Testament is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also the fact that in these particular verses, the injustice Habakkuk's talking about is that he knows Israel are sinful. That's almost undeniable. Again, we'll talk about that in chapter 2. It's the fact that he's taking issue with the exact method of judgment God is using, which is that of Babylon. Babylon arguably are worse than Israel, because they are pagan to the core. Israel at least had a kind of a good foundation, then just went what's the word? They went and just ruined it after that. They fell away. But Babylon, you can read the Enuma Elish, it's just all pagan doctrine, basically. So he's taking issue with the methods of Babylon. It's like, why would you, okay, Israel are bad, but why would you use an even worse nation or a bad nation to come judge them? That's the issue of judgment he's talking about. But yeah, we hopefully find resolution later on in the book.
Enuma Elish's creation?
Yeah, that's the Babylonian creation myth, their version of Genesis.
Right. Okay. So, and then we just wanted to highlight there, verse 13, about how it says, "You who are of pure eyes and to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" Again, Habakkuk recognizes that God is a God of holiness. And again, that is totally correct. That is a good presupposition to start with, that God is holy. But again, he just sort of goes wrong, and we often do, that he looks at injustices in society and says that the fact that God is allowing this to happen makes God unjust, which is just incorrect. That is, anything that flows from God is justice and is holiness. Anything that flows from humanity, the flesh, evidently is sinful post-fall. And so that's what we wanted to emphasize in these points, that God is holy and anything that God institutes is holy. So in this case, Habakkuk is so confused why he's going to use Babylon, which is a worse nation than Israel, to discipline Israel. And rather what we want to say is you just can't question God in that regard. Anything that God chooses to do is by definition holy, because God is holy.
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 2 is the righteousness. The righteous shall live by his faith. And the point that I just wanted to highlight there is verse 4, which is, "Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith." Again, there is an emphasis of faith. It is faith that establishes a relationship with God. It was faith through Abraham that established that covenant. And again, God's sovereignty. And again, New Testament, Ephesians 2, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith."
And the knowledge of yourselves is the gift of God.
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Let's go. So now we'll get into some specific things that Israel were doing wrong. So the 5 woes. First, for the sake of time, we're going to put the first 2 together. So these are: woe to those who profit from unjust economics. So that would be those in power or the rich abusing the poor and making the poor poorer so they can become richer. And there are differences in the first 2 woes, but again, we'll just put them together for simplicity. Yeah. The third one is woe to those who use slave labor to build cities. Number 4 is woe to those who abuse alcohol and sex. And number 5 is woe to those who worship idols.
Rightio. So Habakkuk in that moment, who are those woes going up to? Or who are those woes addressed to? What?
Yeah, so the woe would basically be, it's basically a point of making clear that this is sin. So woe to those destruction to you who profit from unjust economics.
So it's a lamentation. Is that correct? A sorrowful.
I don't know if it's sorrowful as such. It's basically, I think it's just stating the facts, like judgment to you or destruction to you.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's being too sorrowful about the destruction.
Okay. So he's saying woe to you, as in destruction to you because of these things you're doing. Because of these things. So the unjust economics.
Yeah. So
as you highlighted.
Yeah, unjust economics. So an example of that for what Judah were doing, and Israel as a whole as well, was God decreed in the Torah that they were to have a year of Jubilee. So every 7th year was to be a year of rest, and then so that's 49, and then the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, was to be a time when all debts were forgiven, slaves were released and returned, anything like that was just reset. But there's absolutely no record in the Bible of this ever taking place. So, and they're actually judged for this not taking place. Later on in Daniel, we can see this in some of the prophecies there. So the point of that is, because the poor weren't set free of their debts, they got into even more debt, and the rich were then able to incur more money unjustly against the law, against the Torah. This was unjust. Point 3, those who use slave labor to build cities. Again, they're using the slaves unjustly, because the Torah says about treating... I think there's a part in the end of chapter 2 that talks about the blood of the slaves, whereas Israel were told to treat their slaves very well. And if they're bleeding, that's not a good sign. That's what the Egyptians do, who they were freed from.
Yeah. Verse 12, woe to him who builds a town with blood.
Yes, that's it. And then number 4, woe to those who abuse alcohol and sex. And it particularly talks about using alcohol to get sex, so for the purpose of seduction. And again, it's addressing those who are in power over others. So those who are in power are abusing alcohol to get sex and that kind of thing, which obviously isn't great. And you don't...
It's wrong, it's sinful.
Yeah, and you don't read a lot about alcohol in the Old Testament, actually. Like, I just kind of thought, can you think of another passage where it's talked about? You read obviously there's Noah's nakedness.
Yes.
And that's another example of drunkenness leading to sexual impurity because of Noah's drunkenness. Yeah. There are probably a few others.
It talks about being like a mocker of wine, or wine produces mockers, or too much wine. So it talks about drunkenness there in other passages. But
so it's basically the idea that don't abuse alcohol, because you'll rule unjustly then. And then finally, woe to those who worship idols. And all of the above that we've talked about, the other 4 woes, could all be seen as idols. Money, slave labour to build cities again, profit, to become the ruling class, alcohol and sex. So these in themselves are idols. But then there were actual idols that Judah were worshipping at the time.
And this is what Judah are doing. Yeah, that is the southern kingdom of Israel. So God's chosen people. Yes, and Habakkuk is clearly expressing his condemnation of it. Of course,
on behalf of God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Exactly. And then I guess it's just an opportunity for us to evaluate ourselves in light of that. What idols are we bowing down to as instead of God? And you can see how seriously these are treated. Even society around us, the value they put on sex and alcohol, that's something to just take account of, I guess, and look at that and show how seriously it's to be treated. Yeah. Finally, in chapter 3, we've got Habakkuk's prayer. So it opens with God arriving on the earth, and it's terrifying. If you read the description, it's absolutely there's the ground shaking. It's quite terrifying, and it reminds me of Stephen Fry, the actor. He gave an interview in Channel 4 a number of years ago, and he said about how that if he was the interviewer asked something about what would you say if you did arrive at those pearly gates, because I think he's an atheist, but it's like, say what was real and you were taken to the pearly gates, you were shown to God, what would you say, Stephen Fry? And he said, I would say, how dare you, what about bone cancer in children? And he listed off all these points. Basically it'd be him giving moral judgment against God.
Yeah, like Habakkuk, but without any fear or reverence.
Exactly. Yeah, but then you read passages like this about God arriving on the earth, or there's other passages in Daniel I really love, and you think, there's no way he's actually going to be like that. There will be nothing in his mind that will give him moral superiority over God. Because I was listening today to another podcast, and the guy was saying about, I think it's in Timothy, it says the law is given for the unjust, so it's not for the just, and it's not. So that it's not, the law isn't a ladder for people to climb to get to God. It's a standard for God to judge those that are beneath him, so that they can. So God's given us these rules, and we can see that these are the standards that we have to keep to. So in the last day, there'll be no opportunity to say, "Oh, I didn't know," or anything like that. It'll be, you knew what these rules are, and I'm going to judge you to what I've told you. I will judge you. There's no kind of wiggling your way around it. Yeah. because I wasn't sure about this little thing. It's like, God's given us His word, and that's final. And if you don't want to obey it, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. And it's equal measure. It's what Israel have done.
Yeah.
And they are going to reap the consequences of it.
Yeah, exactly.
That is the takeover from Babylon.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then verse 13 I quite liked, and you can see if this reminds you of anything else in the Bible. Look, so verse 13 of chapter 3 is, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. Selah.
That sounds a little bit familiar to me.
Yes.
It's like it's pointing to back and then forward.
Yep.
And then fulfilled. It's pointing to Genesis.
Chapter 3, I think.
So about how, what was the passage?
So it's the woman, so after the fall, Eve is given a chance. She's given a prophecy. It says, your offspring shall crush the head of the snake, but the snake shall bruise his heel. And it's talking about you crush the head of the house of the wicked. So it's the snake being crushed.
So it's pointing towards, again, Jesus. Just like, again, every passage is pointing towards Jesus. And Jesus, for his love for his people, and how his people can express love back.
Yeah.
So amazing.
Just to summarize Habakkuk, it's the idea of we have suffering in this world, quite often because of the sin in our own lives, or sometimes anyway. And God will bring judgment. He may bring judgment by ways that seem unjust at the moment, such as Babylon, or something like that in our own lives. But in time we will see the purpose of this when we wrestle with it. And also that God will finally judge in one day, and it will be perfect judgment that no one can say anything to, because we know the law. We know how to keep it. And while we can't keep it, we have Jesus Christ to rely on, because it's His salvation that we have.
Has been imputed on us.
Has been imputed on us, so that we can be saved. And the final verse just to consider is James 1 verse 2. So it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. So Habakkuk finishes off this book by waiting for this day of justice. So it's up to us to wait and rejoice in our suffering till this day of justice comes.
Brilliant. And with that, we will end it there, and we will see you in the next podcast. Bye, guys.